Actually, it's afternoon for you. Is it good afternoon, Michael?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Good afternoon or good morning
Right.
to
Yeah.
you.
It's morning. Yeah, it's still morning for me. We're here today to discuss Emil Bock's The Apocalypse of St. John, which is this book right here, which is actually like this is actually it's actually not copyrighted. It's out of, I mean, it's so it
Hmm.
can actually be copied from. It actually has like kind of an
You should
open
just publish
license.
your readings of it then.
Yeah, it says I could, yeah, I could. So if I wanted to publish my readings of the text, I could do that without any issues because it is it is an open, out of print, no longer copyrighted text. Um, so um, so I will start by talking about like why I decided this text would be worth discussing. Like both of us have an interest in Owen Barfield,
Hmm.
and I on like kind of the Owen Barfield site, I came across Owen Barfield's review of this book, which was quite glowing. And I had just been listening to some of Rudolf Steiner's lectures on the apocalypse. And so I thought this might be a text worth approaching. And it's going to be radically different from what both of us grew up with. Both of us coming from like Pentecostal evangelical world, which has which very much puts this particular text front and center.
Hmm.
Like it's
Yeah.
very important to its vision for the faith. So that's like, so what's shared, I suppose, would be a sense of its importance. But the way the text is read is very different.
Yeah.
I would just like to start by asking you, like, what were your overall impressions of the text?
Um, it's very interesting. Like Revelation just as a book is something that I definitely have a lot of trepidations around just because of how it's been presented, um, throughout my life. So it's there's a lot of difficulties that I have there with it. And so yeah, I would like in some sense, even though I kind of reject a lot of that kind of literalist, fundamentalist reading of it, it's still inscribed to me at so many different levels. So um I guess I see this as like an interesting opportunity to kind of like re-examine some of those deep felt assumptions that I'm not really in touch with, but that kind of come up as I start reading through the text. But like I in terms of like Barfield's glowing review of Steiner and his work, like that's always been a big question mark for me. So I wanted
Sure.
like to kind of explore that some more because I have a hard time categorizing that whole realm. It just
Yeah, the fear of opening the doors to Gnosticism. It's
yeah.
like, oh yeah, here lies
Well,
heresy. Yeah.
exactly, and it's a completely different. Yeah, I just don't have the categories. I think that's what I was
Yeah.
saying prior
No, I
to
totally.
this recording. Is like it's just it's hard for me to find any sort of mapping, and unfortunately, that's still a lot of what I rely on as my initial response to things. Is like how do I map this out, and
Right.
and how do I talk about it, which I'm still figuring that out.
Okay. So let's go ahead and talk about that for. There's a few interesting things. It's like, first of all, on the like, I come from the same kind of like religious background, so I totally identify with what you're saying. And it strikes me as very bizarre to read a text that is clearly symbolic, deeply symbolic,
Hmm.
almost in every word of the text in a literal way. Strikes me as very odd. And then what I would say that I share is a sense that the book is, here's what I share with like with the background that I came out of. Their sense that this text is important is correct. But
Hmm.
I think the approach to reading it, the literalistic approach to reading it is a mistake,
Yeah.
because I think that this is a text that is trying to trying to speak directly from the spiritual realm. And I'm already sounding vaguely Gnostic there. But you know what? I mean, but we have, I mean, as Christians, we have to understand that like we are in fact an initiatory faith that takes the realm of spirit seriously.
Hmm.
So you can't avoid you cannot be a Christian and avoid talking about those things altogether. And although it is certainly right to have discernment and use some caution in
Yeah.
talking about those
So,
things.
quick sidebar. Maybe this is related,
No,
but
yeah,
I was watching
I'm fine with this conversation going wherever it goes.
Owen Barfield's grandson, who also shares his name, Owen
Yeah.
Barfield. He was talking about his grandfather's work, and he mentioned, I guess, traditionally that the official anthropology of the church was that humans were composed of a spirit, soul, and body. And then at some point, at like, I don't know, like in the 800s, there was like, I don't know if it was which council it was, they struck out spirit. Is that
This
and
is
when
actually,
he
yeah, I was actually
okay,
talking about it in our
okay,
little Voxer group. I was actually talking about this
I'm not caught
yesterday.
up, so
Yeah,
I'm
that's
behind
fine.
on
That's fine.
everything.
That's fine. I was literally talking about that exact thing.
Okay.
That exact thing. And so here's the thing. So the official Catholic position is that it isn't heretical to keep, it is not heresy to consider spirit and soul to be separate things,
Uh-huh.
despite the fact that there were medieval councils that kind of collapsed that distinction.
Hmm.
And the reason it's not considered heretical is because St. Paul clearly uses that language.
Yeah.
They are in fact separate. St. Paul talks about them separately.
Yeah.
And I actually think that, and this kind of, it actually happened later historically. It happened in that like magical window of time where all the bad things happen, which is like in that early 14th century, where there was a massive shift in a materialist direction. Like I mean, that's the bottom line. There's a
Yeah.
massive shift in theology in a materialist direction, and that's exactly when that like soul spirit uh separation gets collapsed. And really I think theology starts to take on like the character of like, to be quite honest, it takes on the character of a deification of mind.
Mhm.
But God is a spirit being, not a mind,
Yeah.
and they are not the same thing.
I agree. But
So
yeah. Yeah. But how would you articulate the difference?
right, so that's the thing. It's like, is it articulable? I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I
Yeah.
wouldn't. I mean, it's like that's the whole thing. It's like because the spirit kind of like inv- it might be tied to consciousness in some way potentially. Although I think like it might be tied to consciousness in some way, and that would be a philosophical wormhole that I don't want to, so I don't want to be committed to that, because I definitely don't
Hmm.
want to, that like the discussion of consciousness in and of itself is just like, we could spend the rest of the time on that and not resolve
Sure.
anything. But I accept that it might be linked to consciousness in some way, and by consciousness I mean awareness.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do not mean like the operation of the rational intellect,
Yeah. The
which might be
thinking.
like a form of consciousness for a human being. It's part of it, but consciousness itself is, I would say,
But
is something
even
more
the
like
way we
pure
define
awareness.
words like thought have changed, where that's another thing Barfield always likes to point out, is like, okay, yeah, thinking isn't just this rational ego things. He links other
Right.
things into thinking, which it's the way all these words have changed, has is kind of cripples our conversations.
Right. I think like with the church fathers understanding of the nous,
Yeah.
or the ancient Hebrew like lev, right? Because lev, heart, is, it's the intellect, and it's also like the intuition and the felt sense of things at the same
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, it's not, it keeps more of, it keeps that separation between soul and spirit. So just, we should probably talk about what we mean here. So if you do say that soul and spirit are separate thing, this is how you mean it. So like human beings are, um have a kind of a trinitarian structure of body, soul, and spirit,
Mm.
right? So, and the soul is like, the soul, when it's not meant to be the same thing as spirit, is like an Aristotelian soul. Like it is the animating animal life force,
Mhm.
kind of like the form, right? That is united to the material body. It's so it's the part that so body and soul make the form matter compound that is a human being. But
Yeah.
human beings, unlike animals, also have this additional part of them, which is the part that was breathed into them by God. Adam
Yeah.
breathed into. So there is a little spark of that divine nature within us
Yeah.
that I would say remains beyond the reach of the corruption of sin. And
Yeah.
the whole point of the Christian life, or frankly any spiritual approach to God, is to bring that part, that divine breath, to be the controlling part.
And here's an interesting question too. That part, is it actually a part that's separate from God, or is it actually the working of God in real time in us?
I think that's the whole point. Like, I think like this is like the entire point of a Trinitarian system and Trinitarian theology, is to
Hmm.
actually like to hold unity and multiplicity and tension. Like, and this is why I'm a Christian and not, say, a Buddhist, even though I am a non-dualist at the end of the day, and and that's because God as a God is a God.
So,
Yeah, go ahead.
so you would
Feel
say,
free to interrupt.
so I just want to be clear because these things are muddy for me. Um, so the spirit would be a portion of you that is actually separate from every other spirit, but maybe you could think of it as the way, like, it is kind of the touch point at which God interacts with us.
I'd say well, we were told in John. Okay, you mentioned something about you mentioned something about John Bear saying that he believes that the gospel of John and the Apocalypse of Saint John should be read together. So I
Yep.
would say that we can look to John's gospel to illuminate what that is. And in John's gospel tells us what the nature of God's spirit is. He says it's a love.
Hmm.
So, and I would say that, so I would relate this to Trinitarian theology. We could talk about this the rest of the time, so I'm just going to like just quickly sketch this.
Yeah.
Trinitarian theology, relationality, holding unity and multiplicity in polar tension, and understanding that the person is a relational being and not an atomized individual in the like kind of modern Western sense. Then I think you start to understand how it we yes, that we are both participating in God and not God at the same time,
Yeah.
and that we're being drawn to drawn into a process of theosis that will increase that resemblance. But that process might be infinite, and that's just my own. I don't know that even at I don't know that even at the end of the age that process doesn't still continue.
Yeah.
But that's another sidetrack.
Yeah. It was so interesting because, like, like, it is. So, like, even looking at the person in and of themselves, just internally, you draw a circle around them. There's no other people in the frame. That, it's relational in this body, soul, spirit, kind of frame, but it's also even in a materialist frame, right? Where we're relational in terms of all these
Yeah.
parts that somehow come into a whole, like, all these bacteria in my gut, and, like, my, like, all these different body parts. And it is weird that, like, we have a hard time seeing even those things sort of relationally or holistically together, because, like, we'll talk about something like, oh, I'm hungry because something going on in my stomach, or it's just I have I'm I'm depressed because of this chemical imbalance in my brain. Like, we have this kind of, I don't know, this weird differentiation into parts
Yes.
that seem to, like, be separate from each other.
Yes. Absolutely. And here's the thing. Okay, so like I use this analogy recently. I think I was talking to Sam, and or leaving a message for Sam, and it's like if you were to take a person, and it's not okay. So first of all, it's not just relationality like with other human beings. It's relationality with everything
Yeah.
horizontally below and above you in the hierarchy. Like
Hmm.
th- you are defined by those relations, right? By your place in that divine hierarchical ordering. Like that's what makes you like what you are. And independent of that, you're nothing. And here's the analogy I use. Like say you take it, let's say you take a person. It's actually even more profound if you say let's take a baby. Let's say I forgive me for saying this, but it's just to make a point. Let's say we were to take your son Maxon, the moment after he was born, instead of being like in like the familial bond with his mother and his father and interacting with the world and the hierarchy above and the hierarchy below, we were to take him and we were to place him into a featureless void, right? A featureless void. How does he ever become a person in any meaningful sense?
Yeah. But
So
I think part of what you're pointing there, that there's this dynamic quality to personhood. So there's something in that part that's changing. Would you say that's the soul? Well, obviously the body's in the flux of that change as well. Would you include? I guess the question
yeah,
I really have is the spirit in that flux of change as
no,
well, or
I
is
think
it?
the spirit is the part that's the spirit is related to what I would say that the spirit is related to what Maximus the Confessor refers to as the natural will that is always oriented toward God. So our
Uh-huh.
spirit is always crying out.
Yeah.
It's always crying out for union with
So in
God.
some sense, what you're saying
Always.
is like it's kind of uncorruptible because of it has some sort of higher ontological status from the kind of flux of things going on underneath it.
I will leave the question as to whether it's corruptible or not. Uh, I would say no, it's not incorruptible. And we have to say that because we know because of fallen angels, right? Because
Mhm.
fallen angels are like
Yeah.
they're only spiritual beings. So there is a possibility of spirit
But
becoming
even
corrupted.
in their fallenness, it seems like in their fallenness, like they came down to earth.
Okay, I'm a universalist, so I agree with you, but I don't want to. Then we'll just get into a
Yeah.
conversation about universalism and whether it's right to believe that um, I personally think it's one of the possible ways of reading what human beings are doing on Earth is for the redemption of the fallen angels. But
Yeah.
that's just, that's just
No, I
a massive
yeah,
massive sidetrack.
I know it's a big
Yeah,
ball
yeah.
of wax. But I would say, yeah. I mean, if you do believe in the reconciliation of all things, yeah, they have to be included,
I would
I
say
would say.
yes. And in that sense, like I think ultimately God will reclaim what rightfully it belongs to him.
Yeah.
Everything. So okay. So let's actually look
Sorry.
yeah,
Sorry.
no, that's fine. No, that's great. No, it was fascinating stuff to talk about. I mean, I don't regret it for 1 second. So let's get back to the text. So the first thing he starts one of the first things he starts talking about like in the forward he starts talking about how like understanding history in the present moment is it's basically impossible for us. And then he says that then he says that real history comes actually from the supersensible realm, and that the apocalypse of John can be used as a guide for reading that supersensible history. What did you think about
Yeah.
that?
Well, I think, I mean, it rings to me obviously true. Like, I mean, even in a materialist sense, right? Like, you could say, like, to what degree do you and I even know the historical significance of this conversation while we're in it? You just don't know. Like, I
Right.
mean, we'd have to come back to it again and again and again to kind of like, get other people's perspectives and things to kind of get a feeling of what really transpired there. You just don't know. Like, so it just seems to me as like an obvious sort of like, okay, you see this much, and yet I guess what's interesting about it is, yeah, this idea of connectedness and participation in larger realities that is a different metaphysics than what most materialists have. But other than that, I think even in like even if you accepted materialist presuppositions, you can still see that this is a reality of kind of the dim awareness that we have of what we're really engaging with at any given time.
Okay. Um, I'm trying to see how like what can you clarify to me how oh I mean in terms of like okay so from you're saying that even from a materialist frame you can see how it's impossible to understand, but what about the okay so what about the second part of it, so we can like yeah even a materialist can agree it's like from the present perspective it's like it's kind of hard to know like
Yeah.
the historical uh impact of a thing, right? That's that. Yeah, I think that's that. I think pretty much like I doubt anyone would really disagree with that. But the second part of that, where he suggests that real history is being made in the super sensible realm. I suppose there's a materialist way of reading that too, right? As sort of like um uh as like kind of like
The sum total of all
the
things.
sum total of like all the materialist sort of
Yeah.
causation layers of causation, whether it be like so I guess suppose that's even comprehensible to for like I would say even for an atomist, which no I mean no materialists really are atomists anymore. Most of them have adopted like a more like non-reductive sort of model, and it definitely you can see how that would apply if you're using a non-reductive materialist physicalist model of reality. You can see how they're like layers that are super sensible because they're nothing that we can ever account for that are tied to the unfolding of events, um, because they're just so many layers of a possible connection that we could never unravel all the
Yeah.
strands. So I think that part is too. But then of course the last part where he claims that the apocalypse of John can be used as a way of seeing the super sensible significance within the historical events. I mean, obviously that's definitely that's a uniquely Christian claim.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because it relies on the fact of this being actually revealed by the creator of all things, you know.
Right. What do you think about that? What do you think about that? Like if you look at like if you think about history and you think about like what's in the apocalypse, it's like have you ever thought about like making that connection?
Well, this sort of allegorical, symbolical approach.
Hmm.
Yeah, just I mean, it's funny, like as you said earlier, like obviously it's a symbolic book, but never like trying to read into it like a sort of spiritual pattern at a high level. Yeah, this never like occurred to me. Because
Right.
that's just a new way of thinking to me in like maybe the last 4 or 5 years.
And same for me too. It's like it makes a lot of sense to me for the way I think now, but
Mm-hmm.
this is the first time I've kind of like okay since I've come back to faith and a
Mm-hmm.
faith that is very different than the kind of faith that I used to have. Um, this is the first time I've actually approached the apocalypse, and attempted to read it symbolically, with that kind of like symbolic vision. I've
Yeah.
never even attempted that before, but now that I am attempting to read it does seem to me that symbolic text,
Yeah.
any symbolic text, the apocalypse of Saint John included, is actually going to have something to say about history because it has things to say about like the nature of reality and the nature of human beings. So it's like it seems to me that like anyone that's open to like symbolism as having any kind of meaning at all, regardless of their perspective, could say that like could affirm that to be true in some way.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And just even the fact that just it's been around for such a long time, um,
Right.
something's going on there. Although, I mean, again, I'm so steeped in certain approaches to this book
Oh yeah,
and the
yeah, I
arguments
understand.
around those approaches. And
So there's a little section that I actually wanted to like read like really really quickly because it just like I felt that it had like I thought felt that it had a lot of salience for our particular moment in history. At least what I feel about this particular moment in history that we're in. He says, and this is in the forward on the bottom of page 9. Our present time is not lacking in revelation. The angels are active. They are descending from heaven. They produce dramatic pictures. They blow their trumpets. They draw away the veil which hides the spirits behind the scene. Not revelation itself, but our sense for revelation is wanting.
yeah, well, anytime angelic and demonic stuff get brought up lately, I sense that there's something really important going on there because for whatever reason, and that is something that was highlighted of significance coming out of a charismatic evangelical Pentecostal background, that kind of thing, that was emphasized, but was and emphasized in a much different way, where honestly, when I think back to it, it always felt like it felt like drawing on something you've been going on recently, it felt like there was a real ontological status to evil, that it had kind of like this sort of good versus evil thing was like a sort of it wasn't like you were necessarily assured you were on the winning side. You had to like, it was a weird sort of I don't know how to figure out the right magic phrases to say, and figure out what demonic curses had maybe potentially been laid on your family, and just all this kind of weird minutia of stuff, which on the one hand I've somewhat rejected coming out of that, but then now feeling like the sense that, well, in the materialist frame that has completely rejected these other levels of reality, right, which includes whatever the angelic, demonic, whatever, as well as what principalities, powers, whatever is meant by those things, um and these hierarchical structures that was a big part of the church dogma for so long, and suddenly it's just kind of washed away. Like I don't know, like I think there's something really to be recovered here, but it's, again, no categories for it, because I have my old categories, which I've rejected
Right.
and I think are kind of off and weird and fundamentalistic, and kind of about getting the math right in terms of your spiritual weapons in battle. Um, and trying to think, well, how did people see this? Like, it's a complete blind spot for me, but I feel like it's going to, it's weird. I always have these intuitions that I just have no rational reason to explain, but I just have an intuition that this is going to become more and more important, this domain.
Yeah, even when here's the odd thing is that even when people of a materialist bent like start to psychologize these things, they like I'm thinking of like, Peterson and Jung, they still give evil too much ontological status. Like, and I don't like the danger of that is that like, okay, it has to do with this. The reason I see this as dangerous, it has to do with this like being becoming distinction. Like, uh only God truly is, like in
Yeah.
an absolute sense, right? We have our being from God. We only exist by virtue of participation in God's eternal being. We have no absolute ontological status of our own. Now, can because but beings which have no absolute ontological status can still engage in evil actions. The question is like, the problem is you can't have any kind of absolute evil, because the only way that you could root anything absolutely is to root it in God directly, in which case you have you have to say that God is at least contains evil, if that's not the whole picture. So then God is like both evil and good simultaneously, which is like certainly like in some spiritual systems is a way of looking at things, but I don't think that's a Christian or Judaic way of looking at
Yeah.
God.
So essentially what you're saying is that even like Satan, let's say, in some sense has to be pursuing what they think is good, even though they
Correct.
have a very warped sense of what it is. They can't,
Right.
there's no creature that pursues evil for evil's sake, because
Which
that would
bit
eventually lead them to just non-being.
which
Like,
Bishop Barron tried to point out to Peterson in their conversation, like when he
yeah,
was talking about how, like the flapping of like he's still trying to get up to back toward God,
right. Because
right?
we do, I feel like we have this caricature of bad people and just bad things in general, that there are people out there that actually want to do evil for evil reasons because that's how they're motivated, and that those
Right,
people just don't exist. It's
right.
laughable when, that's kind of the mark of bad storytelling, when your villains are just, they don't have a real depth to why they're doing what they're doing. It just kind of, the story falls flat.
Right. Yeah. Like, yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's like, if I were to try to, if you were to ask me to like summarize the Christian story into two words, I would say those two, that story is love wins. That's a story that, I mean, and which just to say that God wins, because
Yeah.
the Gospel of John tells us that God is love. Like that is like the relational, you know, the relational substance that is that is the triune God. Love is what it is.
Hmm.
And the Christian story is that triumph. And I don't see how like annihilation or um, uh, um, eternal torment can have any part of the story that is ultimately love wins.
Yeah.
Because that doesn't. Because then you're just like you're rendering the entire story incoherent at that point, as far as I'm concerned. I promise not to get into that whole universalist conversation.
No, I think
And then
it's
went there
relevant.
anyway because we're talking, because it's related to like to
Yeah.
me it's like
Well, it depends. It really informs how you read this book, and the
yes,
possibilities you're willing to engender. Because I feel like, in the
right,
old reading of the book, there was a very limited set of possibilities, that it was like a straitjacket for the interpretation of the book.
right.
And so this more open way it's refreshing, but it's also scary, because it's like, wow, the possibilities are now way more than I thought.
And you're right. And Emil Bock has like already told us like early on. He's like when he says that it's like it's a way of reading that how the real history that is in the super sensible realm.
Mhm.
He's also like saying that, and he's also saying this not in a like, and he's not saying that this is only for like the last days. It's not just about reading the history of the last days. It's about reading how um is history always is coming from this super sensible realm to impact us, and like
Yeah.
that no matter what time we are in, we can always reference this as a way of like understanding the spiritual significance of the historical events that unfold us, which I think would also apply to like, I think you could also say the same thing about culture and the church and a lot of other things too. But okay, so that's that. Okay, so let's see. I think we covered that, the history and the super sensible thing. Let's see. Okay, so then he goes on to talking about like basically talking about like you have like the series of movements, the sequences of the seven seals, the seven trumpets, and the seven vials of wrath. And then he ties those to each to a separate like um uh spiritual sense, right?
Mhm.
So he ties the seals to the spiritual mode of seeing, which imagination, like the seeing of spiritual images, and then he ties the trumpets to the spiritual sense of inspiration, which is tied uh, to to a hunger for music, and also to like an elevated form of speech that's a more properly spiritual speech. and then the vials he ties to the vials of wrath he ties to he the exact wording he uses a spiritual octave of the sense of touch, and he ties that to intuition and to our hunger for love. I was at first, it took me a while to get the intuition link. And then I'm like, I thought about like, well, wait a minute. The language that we use to talk about intuition is always related to feeling. We say, I felt this, I felt that. When we're talking about something that we intuited, we usually don't say I think blah, right?
Yeah.
That's something that we came to intellectually. But it's when something that was an intuition, we say, I just felt like. So I think that's right. That like it is actually like it is really like a spiritual octave of the sense of touch is like a really perfect way of putting it. And which I can go
Yeah.
ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, like, I don't know. There's a sense that I often have where when you're having certain experiences that where you intuit something, it is like something like is kind of arresting your attention and kind of like, and it does feel very much like an outside in perspective, even though you feel it inside. It's very much a sense of like, okay, there's a sense of being in touch with something larger. That's
Right. Yes, 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 yes. I mean, you think like I like I talk about this a lot when I'm trying to help people understand what Barfield is driving at when he's
Mhm,
talking about participation. It's like you, I like I try to like walk people through thinking about like what their primary felt sense of a thing is
mhm,
before they start engaging in abstractions to explain the experience.
yeah,
And if you can put people in the mindset of thinking about that, it's universal. Like everyone, it's like when you listen to a really beautiful piece of music, your felt sense of that is that it's a communication from the spiritual realm to your soul or your
yeah,
spirit.
yeah,
Period. That is
yeah,
like that's the universal experience.
hmm,
You have to abstractly de- convince yourself that your own felt experience is an illusion or a
yeah,
trick because you have these like rationalist propositions that tell you that that's not really what's going on. There's actually like this chemical reaction in my brain that makes
yeah.
me feel this way and so I react. But that's not anyone's
What,
primary
here?
actual
Huh?
experience.
Headphones here?
Okay, my mom. Cool.
Oh, I thought you weren't, sorry.
Sorry,
Oh, no problem. Stuff happens.
sorry.
It's okay. So um I think that was the one like the imagination and like spiritual seeing. I think that one's easy to get right because it's like we all have like these images that like come into our imagination and it's like we don't really like they're not images in the same way that like visual images are. There's somehow like they're 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 more hidden, they're more obscure, but at the same time they can have more vividness to them. So like to me that was like and then I'm very auditory, very auditory, and like the whole like the inspiration and the connection to music and elevated speech. I've actually that elevated speech thing, it's like that's something that I have direct experience of.
Hmm.
Like I felt that like where I just like I have had this experience where like words are just flowing through me and I have no
Yeah,
idea like
yeah,
where they came from and it's like I hear them come out of my mouth. I don't know where I
yeah.
got it. I don't know, but I just immediately know that it's like important and that it's
Specifically, writing or speaking or all
speaking
the
for
above.
me.
Yeah.
Speaking for me because I'm auditory. I think I'm actually like I writing and writing for me engages my I'm also I'm a very analytical person too. I'm like I'm both intuitive and analytical, and for whatever reason, the act of writing engages my analytical, argumentative brain.
Yeah.
So it's a little harder to me, except for writing poetry is an exception to that.
Yeah.
And fiction.
What's funny, I find, yeah, you talk about auditory versus, I feel like memory works a lot differently with sound. Like, since I've not been reading the book visually, like
Right.
if I was reading it visually, I would have a different perspective on it completely. I know that because like when I go to recall something, I actually like kind of visually see where I was at in the book, and like that's kind of how it gets organized. And my sister has said this to me. I don't know if this is unique to us, but she says, when I read a book, I like to read it because I can criticize it better. But there
Mm.
is something about the auditory version where you're pulled along with the meaning of the words, and you don't have that sense, you don't have that ability to kind of like stop, start, criticize, take apart, put the Lego pieces in the order you think they should be, kind of approach to it. You're carried away on something, which is it's very different now, which I like. I mean, I say that's how I consume a lot of content nowadays. But my ability to compress what it is that I was in contact with into like a crystalline structure that I can recall and interact with is much less in that form.
Much less. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, I agree with you, which is why I think like I totally understand exactly what you're talking about, because my pattern is normally to most of my audiobook listening is fiction.
Hmm.
And uh I really don't do nonfiction much in audio format.
Interesting.
Unless it's just something extra that I'm trying to get in. Um uh and I know I'm not gonna have time to read it. But mostly I prioritize fiction for audiobooks. I will say this is interesting. Like this whole process that I've been doing where I've been both reading the text and then after I've read the text then recording it. So I'm
Yeah.
actually doing both. That's really interesting because I actually find that process actually like I think that really helps me a lot because I think that I'm engaging more of my brain
Hmm.
by doing it that way because I think you're right to link like when you're listening to something, I think you're more likely to
Yeah. The
react
text is very
intuitively to
compressed.
it. Right. You're
And so
more
you
likely to
you
react
have
to
to
it.
bring a lot of meaning to it to convert that into speech.
Right. Yeah. 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 Absolutely. Um so um uh what do you think about what do you think about like the specific linking? I mean, to me, it's like to me like the linking of the separate cycles to those senses. That seems to me to be pretty evident. I didn't have a problem with like that symbolism.
Linking what to what? I'm sorry.
He specifically links the seals to the imaginative
Imagination.
to the spirit
I think,
to
yeah,
the
that I think that
spiritual
works well
imagination.
because and the reason I say I feel there's something about the imagination that is always drawn on by the hidden, this idea of something being hidden, like it's there, it's being
Right.
interacted with in this sort of promise. And this is the way fiction works. There's always a sort of hidden thing that the text is circling around and promising to reveal, and that's why you stay engaged with it. But it's not explicitly made reference to, but it's there, and that's really what engages your imagination, so that you're able to now construct that hidden mysterious center becomes the locus around where the world coheres together.
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah. The hiddenness, I think I like the hiddenness too. Is like that seems. It's good that you point that out because if you actually think about what the experience of imaginative, like in the imaginative imaging is, it is there is an obscurity and a hiddenness to it. It's not like the same as looking at a photograph. Although dreams are maybe an exception to that. Like his dreams are like
Yeah.
super vivid.
Yeah. There's Yeah, I don't know how your memory works. I've always had kind of somewhat of a photographic memory, but it's like a blurry photographic memory. So it's like, and depending on how vivid it is, like more of the details are, filled in. Um, Yeah, so that's an interesting way of thinking about it. Yeah, and I do think that there's something about we are such visual creatures,
Mm.
and oftentimes what we see will override what we hear, in terms of precedence in the hierarchy. Because I mean, and I wonder if it's always been like that. Like if we've come into this, like if historically we maybe were more auditory in our focus, and that we've, because this is like when another thing Barfield loves to say is that like if a if a pre-modern could look through the eyes of a modern person, like he would in his consciousness, the first thing he would probably say is like, oh, look how all the objects stand out,
Mm.
because we prioritize not just seeing but processing, breaking down, analyzing what we've seen into all its component parts, so
Well,
that all the,
specifically seeing parts. That's what we prioritize. We prioritize
but
like
that takes a lot,
focus.
that takes a lot more processing power
Right.
to do that,
Right. Right.
versus to see this kind of tapestry of colors and light that's integrated with me, and I'm in it, and I'm kind of more fluidly in that space, to break it down into all its parts, and to do that all the time as our kind of prominent mode of seeing, I think is perhaps unique. But I,
It occurs to me that you can see like why ancients like took dreams seriously as spiritual communications. Like thinking about like what we were just talking about, because dreams are an instance where you actually have like all of these things coming together, right? Like it's that the spiritual the spiritual visual, auditory, and sensory input, like all, I mean, because I don't know about you, but at least to me in my dreams, like I can feel things
yeah,
in my dreams. It's like like there's a sense of touch in my dreams. So you can see like why those were taken seriously as like communications from the spirit world. So um okay.
sorry,
No,
my instincts always is towards rabbit trails.
no, it's fine. No, no. I think that's great. It's great to explore these things. I have no problem with that whatsoever. Okay, so what do you think about what he says about like how like we have these appetites, and he wrote this like in the, I think the, just after World War II.
Mhm.
I'm gonna hold on, let me pause recording for a second here because Sherry just messaged me. Hey
Hey
Sherry.
Sherry.
Sherry was
Hi.
able to join us after all.
Sorry, so late. Are you wrapping up?
No.
No. We're still okay. So we just to kind of like catch you up to steam, like we started talking about like, well, we kind of just introduced like what we thought about the text of the Apocalypse of Saint John in general, like the actual like the book of the Bible, and
Mhm.
then we talked about like why we decided to read this book. We talked about like what Bach talks about history, and how the supersensible impacts history, and how we can use the Apocalypse as a guide to reading that supersensible history. And then we started talking about like seals, trumpets, and vials,
Oh boy.
and and how seals were related. He relates seals to the spiritual vision, imagination, and he relates trumpets to
Mm,
the spiritual auditory sense and elevated speech, the hunger for
yeah.
music, inspiration, and then how the vials of wrath are tied to the spiritual uh, touch in a spiritual octave, as he says. Uh, um, which he relates to intuition and the hunger for love. So, and we were just kind of going through and talking about those, and I think we were just starting to talk about like the vials, and I had talked about how like uh, um, that was the one that was the hardest for me to understand until I thought about how we actually use language when we talk about things that we intuit,
Yeah.
because we always say I felt or I feel,
Yes.
which does actually make that linking to the sense of touch.
We
And
all
then we were just kind of going through and seeing if those connections held up for us. That's what we were
right,
talking
right,
about.
right. Well, as you know, my week's been a blur. But
Yeah.
I did listen to the forward and the, the first 3 chapters actually that you put up. But why don't you guys just go ahead and talk, and if I have something to add, I'll add. Otherwise, I'll just
Okay.
listen.
Yeah, sure. So I actually I wanted to talk about there was actually a passage that I wanted to read that from page 13. He's talking about one of these senses. Well, first of all, I mean, he relates all of this to kind of like desires in our age, right? How we have and how those desires and how those desires get corrupted. Apparently he didn't hold the radio in very high esteem. I don't know what he would think about digital music.
The internet.
Yeah, or the internet, but he kind of saw that as as actually a corruption of the desire for music in some way. That was interesting, but I think I don't I think that may have been a little bit extreme. But the notion that that we have these these hungers that for this spiritual vision, spiritual auditory sensation, and felt and spiritual felt sense of things. That
Mm-hmm.
much is correct, and it is all. I think is also correct in pointing that all of these things can become corrupted.
Mm.
And the one part that I thought was particularly interesting. Like in terms of the visual. I mean, pornography makes it pretty obvious. In what way that can become corrupted. And then in terms of the auditory, it's you can see that kind of corruption in a lot of the music where it's just really a lot of the music that's out there these days really degra- degrades people. From my
I
point of
have
view.
I have a
Go
little
ahead.
I have a little thought actually. I was thinking about this yesterday because I was listening to some music in the car on the way home, and it was electronic music, and I happen to know the artist and kind of know a little bit of what he's going through, and so I was listening to it, and I could hear it was an older track, so he's kind of progressed from a place to another place,
Right.
and in this older track, I could hear the question. Right? I could hear a question. And what was as I started thinking, why do I hear a question here? And what was interesting about that was, you know how when we say, do you know what time it is?
Right.
Right?
Right.
We have
A
a little
lilt.
we
Yeah.
have, and questions always go up,
Right.
right? And so I was listening to the music and I could hear it. It had a mysterious thing. The question was kind of like, who are you, really? Like, he was encountering something and he was asking who this thing was, right? And so yeah, you could hear the question in the music. And then the most recent piece that he's done was this settled I don't even know how to describe it. It's kind of like gives you the feeling when you hear the tones, the notes that that of peace, right? Of settledness, of questions having been answered, and a description. The description, like if you asked a question, "Who are you?" Then let's say the next, and the thing was horrifying. The next piece would be describing that horrifying thing, right? It wouldn't be peaceful. It wouldn't be kind. It wouldn't be generous. But in his next piece, it is. So that's what he's encountered, right? And I was thinking about all of that, and I was thinking, isn't that interesting that you can actually hear the language just in the tone of the music itself.
Right.
Like you can hear the conversation that's being had. And when you were just talking about that being corrupted, I thought the first thing that came to my mind in light of all what I just said was people aren't asking honest questions in their music, right? They're trying to wield the thing, which is always what ends up happening, right? They're trying to manipulate it. Good music is when someone is asking an honest question, and then when they get an answer, they're honest enough because they were honest enough to ask an honest question.
Right.
That their answer, they'll lay it out, whatever it is. You know what I'm saying? Does that make any sense?
Right.
What
Well,
I
I think you do have like, okay, so this is the way that the way that all of the, I think first of all, all of these things seem to be properly related to various arts, right? So like that, that the imaginative visual seems to be related to the visual arts, obviously, and the inspiration, auditory, hunger for music part seems to be obviously related to music. I would say poetry actually as well as part of that, you know, like lyrical song, which is like the combination of the two. And then I think like I don't know like what is the artistic expression of the kinetic. I would say comes out in like lots of physical things we do, like like playing sports, dance, um, um, things like that. So I think that like and I think what the corruption comes in when the ego is getting in the way, because and keeping you from like completely
yeah.
entering that flow state consciousness where you're just like giving yourself up to, frankly, what I think is the spiritual world coming in and expressing itself through you.
Well, that would be the wielding of it, right? The manipulation of it.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you're actually allowing the spiritual to communicate through you, that is the not manipulating, because you're letting go.
Right.
Right. It's the
Right.
failure to
The
let go. The failure to let go and let that come through you is what causes the corruption.
Right.
But even that, like I would say, you're probably just unawares engaging with a different spirit.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Right. Right.
Could you expand on that a bit, Michael? I'm just curious.
Well, I earlier in the conversation, I was talking about just sort of intuition that these angelic, you know, and demonic, and just all these layers in the hierarchy that are above us spiritually are going to be more and more important. And which is weird for me to say that, because I don't really have any categories for all those things. But I know, Paul has always talked about, like, spiritual being this word that fudges. He's trying to find ways to define it in sort of a materialist nomenclature, right? So like we could talk about, like, things like school spirit and like things like that. And so I think that that's maybe a good way to kind of try and pull it into our conscious recognition that there's you know I don't know, like I think of Luke's fascination with Rupert Sheldrake and morphic resonance and things like that. But there's always some higher thing that's kind of being constructed and interacted with and participated with, even in the
Participation is
most
the key.
mundane.
Yeah. Right. It's participation in a consciousness that is other than God.
So what comes to my mind is the Silmarillion, right? The creation story in the Silmarillion, right, comes to my mind immediately, like, because the song is being sung and it's just being participated in, right, by everything. And then Melkor decides, is Melkor? Yeah. Decides to manipulate it.
Right.
Right, by singing off key and whatever. But what ends up happening is it just gets integrated in,
and it's a redirection of worship away from the proper direction of worship.
It's a distraction, right? Yeah. But I think the most interesting part about that is that it actually just gets sucked up into it anyway.
Yeah.
Well, that actually connects directly to maybe Tolkien was a universalist too. but yeah, because that actually kind of connects to the earlier part of our conversation, which is like, if I were to give a 2-word summary of the Christian story, the 2-word summary is love wins. And I don't think it's a conditional victory.
No.
So, yeah. It's not a Pyrrhic victory. It's not a conditional victory. It's an absolute victory.
But back to the whole music thing, I'm just thinking, like, have a question, kind of like, do you think that, because I've written songs and oftentimes the music of the song comes to my mind, right? And then the lyrics get laid down on top of that. It's never never the other way around. Like when you're writing a song, you can write a poem and then it's, the lyrics, right?
Right.
The words. And I have taken poems and then constructed music around those, made it fit, but it's always an odd fit, right? To do
Yeah.
that.
Right.
But generally when you're writing a song, you have a music, right? And the music is speaking its own language. And then from that music that the lyrics are derived, like they're actually born out of that music. If the music's asking a question, the lyrics will be asking a question. If the music is, talking about sadness, then the lyrics will reflect, and so on, right?
Have you ever had bits of music come to you in a dream?
No, but my
Because
sister has that.
I've
My
had
sister has written.
I've had that happen, and I don't even write music. I don't even write music. I don't write songs, but I do have I think sometimes it showed up in the rhythm of some of my poems, maybe. But I do have I actually have a fairly frequent occurrence of where I have I dream bits of music that are not from I know they're not from a song that I've heard before. They're just
Well, I mean, I'm kind of,
so.
I'm kind of implying that music is the original language with all of this.
No, I think that's right, and that reminds me of what Mark Vernon said in one of his conversations with Michael, where he said that speech is an elevated form of music, and he didn't explain it, and he didn't argue for it. He just said it, but he didn't need to explain it to me, and he didn't need to argue for it because to me it's like, yep, that's right, that's right. And I think that's why Tolkien has creation happen through song. Like Tolkien was intuiting that same thing too, how deeply fundamental. And we do know that God, yeah, God speaks, but I would say that that music is spiritual speech, and that there is a deep connection between those things. So
Yeah.
But that just strikes me too. I mean, it just kind of popped into my mind, but just such a beautiful image of God singing
Yeah.
creation into existence.
Yeah. Well, my oldest daughter, when we moved to Switzerland, she was 3.5, and she was surrounded by Swiss German, and so she could hear it, but she didn't understand it, and she couldn't speak it. She only spoke English. And my husband's godfather's wife was a special ed teacher, so she worked with kids who had learning disabilities or whatever, all kinds of children. And she heard my daughter one day. So my daughter went through a phase where when she was learning Swiss, where she learned the song first. That was the first thing she learned.
right.
And she could literally dupe Swiss people into thinking she was speaking Swiss German.
Right.
But it was like gobbledygook, right? So the
Oh.
words didn't match at all. Like she didn't have any words, but
Right.
she would sing the lilt of the language.
Right.
And one day I watched her. She was in our yard, and there was two little old ladies walking by, and she goes, "Hi," in Swiss. "Hello," she was very social, and they came over. "Oh, look at the little girl. She's so cute," And then my daughter starts talking to them, and they're like, "Oh," and then you can see their faces going, because she wasn't saying anything that they could understand.
Right.
She sounded
Right.
like she was.
Right. It sounded like she was, but she wasn't. Yeah.
Right. It's amazing. It
Yeah.
was
Right.
so,
Right. It's well, if you think about the way, okay, now I was just Michael. I can't help but think of the of the video of your son starting to make some of his first sounds, and it's there's a musical quality to the babble of infants.
Mm-hmm.
It absolutely has a musical quality. It really sounds more like song than it does like speech.
yeah.
So it's really I think yeah, it's deep and I'm an auditory person, so that's the one that's easiest for me to get. I had to think a little bit harder about the imagination and the intuition, although actually the intuition, once I got it because it's that is our language betrays the fact that spiritual octave of the sense of touch language that Bock uses. It's our language when we describe intuition shows that that is actually how we think about it, because we say, I had a feeling, I felt,
Mhm.
that's how we talk about our intuitions. So once I got it, once I got it, I got it. But just on that last one, there's just one little part I wanted to read because it seems like so applicable to like our particular historical moment with like a lot of like the culture war stuff, like over like sexuality and things like that. It's on page 13. Let's see. Let's see. Yeah, right here. The most irresistible desire in our age is a chaotic influence from the plane of intuition. It is not necessary to specify in detail the forms assumed by the hunger for love. A veritable ocean of wishes and urges has engulfed men and women. Errors and perplexities abound. The chaos is made complete by the false fulfillment which the hunger for love finds. The foaming waves of this ocean can only be smoothed when mankind perceives that its longing points beyond the earthly domain.
Can you read that last sentence one more time?
Yeah, yeah. The foaming waves of this ocean can only be smoothed when mankind perceives that its longing points beyond the earthly domain. That basically was it's saying. I mean, that the thing that the love that we have, the real deep longing, that hunger for love, is for union with the source, which is God, which is the source of love. Love, God is love. So it's like, in as much as like we get caught up
Yeah.
in these kind of like lesser expressions of it, it misdirects us. So
There was a while ago, I organized a couple of talks on the Discord with people from the Pajot Facebook group. This is
right.
last year or whatever. And I talked to one of the guys now, I can't remember his name, but he did an article on sand, the symbolism of sand. And we got talking, and he didn't really touch on this, but I thought of it while we were talking, and I asked him about it, and it just came to me now when you were, because it talks about this foaming ocean, right? Being still. And it is about the book of Revelation. And in the book of Revelation, there's a crystal sea.
Right.
Right. And what's interesting about, now I can't remember exactly what his article on sand was as I'm saying this. I can only remember the thing that we both jumped on and we're like, whoa, that's interesting, because sand is multiplicity, right? Symbolic of multiplicity. And sand, when it's bonded, is glass. Is crystal.
Right.
And
right. So it suggests that it's an image of like the unity in the love that fully satiates.
right. And
So
it's
there
still
that hunger is it no longer continues as a hunger that doesn't know where to direct itself, because it's finally fully satiated. And yeah.
right. And that image of the crystal sea, it's completely still, right? Like
Yeah.
solidified.
Right.
It's solid. It's done. Perhaps, I don't know. That
No,
just came.
that's really good. And I think this is actually like a good place to wrap it up, because I know Michael needs to go. We got through most of the forward, so I'm thinking like next time we can maybe go ahead and open it up to discussing chapters 1, 2, and 3 um, in total, because I know we've all like listened to the first 3 chapters or read the first 3 chapters. So does that sound like a reasonable plan? Because we got most of the way
Yeah.
through we basically got like introduced the book and got through the forward. And
Yeah.
that's what we accomplished. So does anybody have any like last observations that they'd want to bring in?
No.
Not off the top of my head.
I think that was ending on the image of like the the hunger for love being finally satiated when it is united with its source, I think is, and the image of the crystal sea, and like the resolution, and the implicit, like, by the way, you're talking about sands being like individual grains of sand and then being like into this like crystal surface. It's like the bringing together of unity and multiplicity. So that's like
Yeah.
that's a good
Good
that's a
ending.
That's a good
Yeah.
ending, I think. Yeah.
Hey, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think, Shari, have you read Bradley Jersak's books? Her Gates Will Never Shut.
No, I haven't read that one.
Okay, it just popped into my head because obviously it's quoting from Revelation, and it's actually a sort of argument from the Bible for universalism. But
Do you want to share that?
I'm sorry.
Do you want to share it,
Share the book?
or just share like what your reflection from the book was?
Yeah. Like
Oh well, it's I would say if you're coming from like the evangelical background, I would read that before David Bentley Hart, because he's so dismissive that like I think some people start reading him and they can't take it. It's too strong a medicine, and they just like, this guy's and he's outrageous, with his weird beliefs. But Bradley Jersak works the exact opposite way. He's like, okay, you think this is the revealed word of God? Let's go through it and let's talk about what these words mean. And, it's very, very detailed analysis of the scripture. And it doesn't come to like any dogmatic conclusions, but it's definitely like, it puts all the scripture in your lap and says, here, you deal with it. But obviously the title shows its leanings.
Yeah. There's also a book, I have it, but I can't think of the title offhand, but it's by a woman named Ilaria Ramelli. She's a top-notch scholar on universalism. Have you heard of her, Nate?
Yeah. Actually, both David Bentley Hart and John Milbank like reference Ramelli frequently. So
right, and she has a book, and so I think if anybody is really hung up on like scripture, they need scripture, and church history, and some she digs into the fathers, of course. She lays that out pretty inarguably most of the time. I can send you the title of the book, Michael.
Yeah, I would love that.
Okay,
yeah.
So now I'm going to open a can of worms, even after I said we were going to wrap it up, because I just feel like I need to ask this question, and I think it is relevant too, because ultimately we're discussing the Apocalypse of John, which is about the last things. So let me just like, what is your like felt intuition of like, what is the thing that makes people cling to belief in hell?
I think it's the spirit of the age. Well, I mean, I'll say this. I think there's I think you would agree. Like I still believe in there's something like that is real, that we will experience in real degrees in life and possibly beyond it. That is something of a sort of when Jesus talks about it, it's always this, what I associate with it is just a sort of regret for like the decisions you made, and like a sort of having to come to terms with the reality of that and what its effects were. And so I think, but I think why this gets clinged to is because it's again, whether you're inside the church or outside of it, it seems like this idea about a certain propositional rigor as being the key to salvation, and whether you're inside the church or outside of it, that seems to be the spirit of the age. And so it's like there's and what I've noticed is that what this means is that the more and more important or religious the idea you're dealing with, the more rigid you become in terms of your approach to it. Like the more you become like any sort of which in reality it should be just the opposite, right? Because the most important things, where the deepest sense of meaning lies, the deepest religious terms and jargon, and that's where the most amount of data compression is being applied, so the most amount of errors are accumulating. So that's where you have to go to update things. You have to be okay with ambiguity there, because that's where, by definitionally, that's where the most of it lies. But we've kind of inverted that, where like the higher, like we can be playful about things that are trivial, but you start climbing that hierarchy of axioms, and like, oh man, people, even a question that might vaguely point in the direction of undermining one of those axioms becomes deadly. You become a heretic just by uttering a question.
Well, what's interesting, I think David Bentley Hart points this out. When, you know, you could be the most staunch advocate of eternal conscious torment, let's say, you know, as one form of hell or whatever. But when a loved one dies, then suddenly you don't believe in it anymore. And I've seen this, you know, like I've seen people, you know, talk about so-and-so needs to get saved and we got to pray for them and, you know, they're going to go to hell and blah, blah, blah. And then they die. And all of a sudden, I know where they are now. They're at peace. And it's like, what? I thought you
Right.
said they were at hell, you know?
Right.
So,
Well, that's because okay. So I would say, yeah, right. That's exactly it. So when it's when it's anytime that it's personally connected to you, suddenly you lose all of your faith in hell.
yeah.
You will
Yeah.
come up with some rationalization why the person you love.
Well, because the personal is so data rich that it just overrides the simplicity of that compressed, you know, proposition.
That's very nice.
But I would say that to God, every single person is that data rich, and that's why universalism.
Yep.
Because we are all that we are all that relevant to God. It's not because I'm not a universalist because of my faith in humanity.
Yeah.
And I think both of you heard me say this before, and it's like, and I still think that hell is very real.
Yeah.
I think still hell is very real, and that I think that in a non-trivial way, all of us are going to pass through hell.
Mm-hmm.
On the road to Jesus always saves each and every single one of us out of the depths of hell. The harrowing of hell was not just like a one-time event that like happened in time. Well, first of all, think about the kind of thing you're talking about. You're talking about the Son of God going into a place that is like not a place that is in physical reality. Like, so why interpret it as like this momentary blip, you know, as like something that's part of a sequence of events, rather than as a deep symbolic way of talking about how God will personally rescue you from your lowest depths, every single one of us. So I think that's a good note to believe it. Although I didn't answer my own question. I didn't answer, but I liked you guys' answers. Thank you.
I just posted a bunch of George MacDonald quotes on this actually in the Discord. If you guys want to go look, it's in Promo's discussion. I wouldn't mind your feedback on it actually. So
okay.
Yeah, you'll see.
I'll take a look.
Just
Thank you guys for joining me today.
Thanks for organizing this.
Yeah, no problem.